On a storm-lashed night in Colorado, a 6-year-old girl trembles in the dark woods, the howls of wolves echoing, until the determined eyes of a service dog pierce the shadows, her final glimmer of hope. As hidden military secrets begin to unravel, every life hangs by a fragile thread. This is more than a fight for survival, it's a journey to uncover the truth. Don't forget to subscribe now so you won't miss our gripping and emotional upcoming film. The screen fades in from black. For a moment, there is nothing but the sound of the wind. A low, haunting whistle, as if the very mountains are breathing. Then slowly the image sharpens. The vast expanse of Colorado's high country stretches across the screen. White, endless white. Snow churns through the air in violent spirals carried by a relentless blizzard that devours the horizon. The sky itself is an iron curtain of gray pressing down on the world like a lid over a coffin. Beneath the swirling storm, a narrow 2-lane road cuts through the wilderness. Its surface is slick with ice, the yellow dividing lines barely visible beneath the snow. The camera lowers the view, closing in on a lone SUV struggling its way through the storm. The headlights pierce only a few feet into the wall of white, flickering as gusts of snow slap against the windshield. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere is as tense as the storm outside. Sarah Parker, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and pale knuckles gripping the steering wheel, glances nervously at the rearview mirror. She doesn't say a word. She doesn't need to. The silence is its own language here, heavy, suffocating. In the back seat, her daughter Lily sits buckled in. Only 6 years old, her small body dwarfed by the oversized winter coat that engulfs her. She hugs a worn, stuffed rabbit to her chest. The rabbit's ear is frayed, its fur matted from years of love and clutching during sleepless nights. Lily's wide blue eyes track the storm outside. But it's not the snow that frightens her. She sneaks a glance at the man in the passenger seat, Mark, Sarah's husband, Lily's stepfather. His presence is an invisible weight that fills every corner of the SUV. Mark's face is all hard lines shadowed by the dim glow of the dashboard lights. His jaw is clenched, a vein pulsing at his temple. He drums his fingers against the armrest with a rhythm that grows more impatient with every passing second. The SUV fishtails, slightly tires slipping on the ice. Sarah tightens her grip, correcting the wheel. "Watch it!" Mark snaps his voice a whip crack. "I've got it," Sarah murmurs, though her voice trembles. Mark scoffs, shaking his head. "You don't have anything. You never do." The words slice through the air, sharp and deliberate. Sarah says nothing, keeping her eyes fixed on the road ahead. But Lily hears it. She always hears it. The small girl pulls the stuffed rabbit closer as though it might shield her from the venom in his tone. The wind outside howls louder, rattling the SUV's frame. Snow pelts against the glass, like shards of broken glass hurled by unseen hands. The world beyond the headlights is swallowed whole, nothing but a void of white chaos. Mark leans forward, gesturing angrily. "You should have left earlier. I told you the storm was coming. But no, you had to wait. You always make everything harder than it has to be." Sarah's knuckles whiten further against the steering wheel. "I was waiting for Lily to finish her school project. She worked so hard on it. She's 6, Mark snaps, cutting her off. "Nobody cares about some school project." Lily flinches. Her little fingers squeeze the rabbit so tightly it seems strain. She lowers her head, willing herself invisible. The cruel tone in his voice is nothing new. She has learned silence is her only shield. The camera lingers on Sarah's face. Her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The storm outside mirrors the storm inside. Then suddenly, a shadow cuts across the headlights. Sarah gasps, jerking the wheel instinctively. A deer bursts out of the white, its body sleek and terrified as it bounds across the road. For a split-second time, freezes. The animal's eyes glow like glass in the headlights, wide with fear. Then chaos. The SUV swerves violently. Tires scream against the ice. Metal groans. Mark curses, grabbing the dashboard. "Sarah," he bellows. The vehicle spins headlights, whipping through the storm in dizzying arcs. The world outside becomes a blur of snow trees and darkness. Lily cries out, the sound raw and small as her rabbit tumbles from her hands. Impact. The SUV crashes through the guardrail wood, splintering under the force. The sound is deafening metal, tearing glass, shattering the guttural roar of destruction. The vehicle plunges down a snowy embankment, rolling, tossing its passengers like rag dolls in the grip of a furious giant. Black. For a moment, only silence. A silence so deep it feels like the world itself has stopped breathing. Then slowly faint sounds return. The groan of twisted metal settling into the snow. The creak of branches overhead, heavy with ice. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls, long, mournful, and far too close. Sarah stirs. Her head is bleeding, a crimson streak trickling down her temple. She groans, forcing her eyes open. The windshield is spiderwebbed with cracks, the dashboard crushed inward. She turns, heart lurching. Lily, her daughter. Her gaze darts frantically through the wreck. The back seat is empty. Lily. Her voice breaks, raw panic flooding her veins. The camera cuts to Lily. The little girl lies several feet from the wreck, thrown clear during the crash. Snow clings to her coat, her tiny breath clouding in the frigid air. Slowly she pushes herself up, trembling, confused. The SUV is half buried in the snow behind her, steam rising from its crumpled hood. But Mark is nowhere to be seen. The passenger door hangs open, swinging in the wind. He is gone. Lily's lips tremble. Mommy? Her voice is so small it is almost swallowed by the storm. No answer, only the shriek of the wind. She stumbles to her feet, clutching the rabbit that somehow landed beside her. Her cheeks burn with cold, her tears freezing almost as soon as they fall. From the shadows of the trees, another howl pierces the night. Closer this time. The camera pulls back, showing Lily's small figure surrounded by endless white. A fragile speck of life against the merciless wilderness. The storm swirls around her, the forest looming like a dark wall. The sense of vulnerability is crushing. She turns in a slow circle, searching for her mother, for safety, for anything familiar. But all she sees is snow and darkness. The howling grows louder, joined by the faint crunch of paws in the snow. Her chest tightens. She hugs the rabbit so close it nearly disappears inside her coat. Mommy. The camera closes in on her tear-streaked face, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Then the screen cuts to black, and the sound of the wolves echoes like a chilling promise. The storm raged on, merciless and unyielding, as if the mountains themselves had decided no one should survive the night. Snowflakes the size of coins battered the little girl's face, stinging her cheeks until they burned raw. Her tiny boots sank deep into the drifts, each step heavier than the last. Lily Parker could barely see her own hands in front of her face, let alone the twisted wreck of the SUV she'd stumbled away from moments earlier. Her breaths came in frantic bursts. Small clouds swallowed instantly by the howling wind. The stuffed rabbit was clutched so tightly against her chest that her arms ached. Every instinct screamed at her to keep moving, to not stop, because to stop here meant freezing. But she was only 6. Her legs shook violently, her body fragile against the brutal cold. Mommy. Her lips moved, her voice cracking, but the storm devoured the word before it could travel a foot. She stumbled forward, the ground, uneven, her little boots slipping on hidden ice. The forest loomed closer now. Dark silhouettes of pines hunched under the weight of snow, their branches heavy and silent. It was both a promise of shelter and a lurking threat. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified by her fear. A low guttural growl broke through the roar of the wind. Lily froze. Her wide blue eyes darted into the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. A wolf. Maybe more than one. Her small chest heaved as her breath quickened. She turned in a circle, desperate, her eyes scanning the tree line. The storm hissed and whispered as though mocking her fear. She thought of running, but her legs refused to move. She was trembling so badly she could barely stay upright. The growl deepened, and then just beyond the reach of her vision, 2 faint points of yellow light blinked open. Eyes. Watching her. Tears welled instantly, blurring her vision. She took a step back, clutching the rabbit tighter, the little stitches biting into her frozen fingers. Her mind screamed for her mother, for anyone, but there was nothing, no one. And then, movement. Not from the shadows where the eyes glowed, but from the opposite side. A large shape emerged from the storm, slow, deliberate, cutting through the snow like it belonged there. At first, Lily thought it was another predator. She whimpered, shrinking back, her tiny form curling inward. But as the figure drew closer, the headlights of the SUV behind her faintly illuminated it just enough to reveal fur. Brown and black, streaked with white. Muscular. Powerful. A dog. He stepped into view fully, his paws steady despite the ice, his chest broad, his head held high against the storm. Snow clung to his coat, but he moved with a grace that defied the chaos around them. His ears were pricked forward, his eyes sharp, intelligent, unwavering, locked onto hers. Lily's trembling lips parted. She'd never seen a dog this big up close. He was nothing like the friendly neighborhood dogs she sometimes saw at the park. There was something different about him, something almost commanding. The growl from the trees deepened, and the yellow eyes shifted closer. The dog, this stranger, turned his head toward the sound, lips curling back just enough to reveal a flash of teeth. A deep warning bark thundered from his chest, rolling through the storm like a shot fired into the dark. The eyes in the shadows paused. For a tense second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as though calculating the risk, the predator withdrew, vanishing back into the void of snow and trees. Lily exhaled shakily, her knees nearly giving out. The dog turned back to her. His gaze softened, not weak, but steady calm, as though assuring her she was no longer alone. She didn't run. She couldn't. Something about the way he looked at her, the way he stood there, unyielding against the storm, made her believe just for a moment that she might be safe. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate. Snow crunched beneath his massive paws, each movement careful, measured. He lowered his head slightly as he approached, not threatening, but protective. Lily's small body swayed. Her lips were blue now, her little hands shaking uncontrollably. She whispered almost inaudible, "H-hi." The dog stopped just a few feet away. His breath steamed in the frigid air chest, rising and falling with a steady rhythm. He tilted his head, studying her, as if trying to understand the quivering child before him. Her vision blurred with tears and exhaustion. She blinked hard, and for a fleeting moment she swore she felt something strange, like a thought that wasn't hers, brushing against her mind. It wasn't words exactly, but more like a feeling. Warmth, assurance. A command, clear and simple. "Follow me." Her tiny heart pounded. She clutched the rabbit tighter, whispering through trembling lips, You want me to come." The dog's eyes glimmered steady and unwavering. He turned, glancing toward the forest, then looked back at her. Another strange pulse of understanding rippled through her chest. She wasn't imagining it. Somehow she just knew. With a trembling step, she followed. The dog moved ahead, breaking a path through the snow. His massive frame shielded her from the worst of the wind, his body cutting a trail she could step into without sinking so deep. She stumbled once, her legs too weak, but he stopped instantly, waiting for her to steady herself before moving again. Every sound in the forest felt magnified. The snap of branches under the weight of ice, the distant cry of wolves, circling, testing, waiting for a chance. But the dog's presence was a barrier, invisible, yet undeniable. Lily's small breaths shivered in the air. Her fingers were so cold they could barely hold on to the rabbit, yet she forced herself to keep going. She whispered to him, her voice breaking in the storm. "Please don't leave me." He glanced back, those eyes locking with hers once more. The connection was unspoken, but real. He wasn't going anywhere. Minutes felt like hours as they moved deeper into the forest. The storm roared above the trees, groaning under the weight of snow. Lily's body screamed with exhaustion, each step a battle against the cold, threatening to claim her. At last the dog halted. Lily nearly bumped into him, her small body colliding with his flank. He didn't move, only lowered his head, ears pricked. She followed his gaze and froze. Not far ahead, half hidden by the trees, shadows shifted. The wolves. They had followed. Fear surged through her veins like fire. Her lips parted in a silent gasp, her tiny fingers clutching the rabbit so tightly she thought she might tear it. The dog stepped forward, placing himself between Lily and the threat. His fur bristled, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. His stance widened, his body tense, ready. The wolves lingered at the tree line, their eyes glowing faintly, their shapes barely visible through the swirling snow. They paced, circling, testing his resolve. Lily trembled, tears freezing on her cheeks. She whispered, "Don't let them." Her voice cracked. The dog barked, loud, fierce, commanding. The sound was enough to send a ripple through the wolves. They faltered, uncertain, before slowly retreating into the darkness. Lily collapsed to her knees, the last of her strength slipping away. The dog turned instantly, nudging her gently with his muzzle. She looked up at him, eyes glassy, lips trembling. Again that strange feeling washed over her. Warmth. Urgency. A command she somehow understood. Stay awake. Keep moving. She nodded weakly, forcing herself up. Her legs felt like sticks of ice, ready to snap, but she clung to his presence, to the strange, invisible tether between them. He led her further deeper into the trees, away from the predators, away from the wreckage, towards something unknown, but safe. And though she could not explain why, Lily knew she trusted him. Completely. Sarah Parker sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers clawing at the edge of her phone, as though holding on to the last thread of sanity. Her chest heaved in shallow, panicked breaths. Outside her window, the storm hadn't relented. It clawed at the glass like a living thing, the snow twisting sideways under the fury of the wind. Somewhere out there, her daughter was alone. Her phone lit up with the number for emergency services. She pressed it with trembling fingers, the ringing loud in her ears, drowning out the thundering storm. 911, what's your emergency? Her voice cracked as the words tore out of her. My daughter, my little girl, she's missing. There was an accident, please. You have to send someone. Ma'am, calm down. What's your location? Sarah swallowed, trying to form words, when a sound in her mind echoed not her own voice, not from outside. A memory sharp as glass. Mark's hand snapping her phone shut hours earlier, his tone cold, calculated. We don't need the cops. Don't you dare call them Sarah. Her stomach churned with the realization. He'd known. He'd wanted her cut off, isolated, powerless. The operator's voice called again, distant tinny, through the storm of her thoughts. Ma'am, are you there? Yes, I'm here. But before she could continue, the line went dead. The screen went black. No signal. Her trembling hand fell into her lap. A sob tore free. The storm outside roared louder, as though mocking her helplessness. Sarah forced herself up, pacing the room, her fingers clutching the locket around her neck. Lily's baby picture inside, worn from years of her touch. She could see Lily's blue eyes so clearly, could hear her tiny voice asking for one more bedtime story. Could feel the warmth of her daughter's hug. The thought of those same arms freezing in the snow made her stomach twist violently. She spun toward the table where Mark's jacket still lay abandoned from before the accident. Her fingers trembled as she searched the pockets. A phone charger, loose cash, and then an envelope worn at the edges with the words, Department of Defense. Confidential stamped across it. Her chest tightened. She sat down, staring at the envelope as though it might explode. Slowly she pulled it open. Inside was a folder thick with pages. On the cover, stamped in bold, Project Sentinel. Her breath caught. The word meant nothing to her, yet it felt like a door opening to a corridor she hadn't known existed. She flipped it open, scanning page after page of jargon and diagrams. Military seals, blacked out lines, phrases that made her skin crawl. Behavioral enhancement in canine units. Predictive threat response, neural sensitivity augmentation. Her eyes widened as one page revealed a photograph. Her fingers tightened as she brought it closer. A German Shepherd. Not just any. The markings, the eyes, she knew that face. Ranger. She pressed her hand against her mouth, a muffled gasp escaping. That dog, the same one she had seen once with Mark months ago before he claimed it had been retired from service. Her mind raced back, piecing fragments together. Mark's evasive answers whenever she'd asked about his work. The way he'd avoided questions about his time away on training missions. The harshness in his eyes whenever Lily had gotten too close to that dog, as though he feared something might happen. Her fingers shook as she turned the page. More images. Notes. A chilling phrase leapt at her from the file subject Ranger, decommissioned due to unpredictable empathic responses. She swallowed hard, bile rising. Empathic responses. What did that even mean? Before she could think further, a knock rattled the front door. Sharp, firm. She froze. The file slipped from her lap pages, spilling across the carpet like a wound opening. Her legs moved on instinct, carrying her toward the door. She peered through the peephole. A man in uniform. Snow caked his shoulders. His badge gleamed faintly in the dim porch light. She yanked the door open. Please, you have to help me. My daughter, she's out there. The officer, Detective Harris, held up a hand to calm her. His eyes, steady and calculating, swept over her pale face. Mrs. Parker, we got the call before the storm cut the lines. I came as soon as I could. Relief surged, but only for a heartbeat. His eyes shifted past her, into the house, landing on the scattered pages. His brow furrowed. Where did you get those? Sarah stammered. They were in Mark's jacket. Please, you don't understand, my daughter. But Harris had already stepped inside his boots, crunching on the fallen papers. He crouched, flipping through them, his jaw tightening. His voice dropped low, urgent. Do you have any idea what this is? Tears burned her eyes. I don't care. My little girl is lost in that storm. I just need you to... Mrs. Parker? He interrupted, his tone sharp. He lifted one of the documents, tapping the header. Project Sentinel wasn't supposed to exist. It was shut down 2 years ago after an incident overseas. They said all units were destroyed. Her lips parted. Units? You mean dogs? Harris's eyes locked onto hers. Not just dogs. Weapons. Living, breathing weapons. Her stomach dropped. She backed into the wall, shaking her head. No, Ranger. He's just a doggy. Harris's voice softened, but his eyes remained grave. If your daughter is with one of them, she may be safer than you realize. But it also means... He hesitated, as though weighing how much truth to give. It means someone will want them back. The words hit her like ice water. She clutched the locket around her neck, her breaths short and ragged. Her mind spun with flashes of Mark. the anger in his voice when she'd begged him to slow down in the storm, the way he'd gripped the wheel tighter, muttering under his breath, the calculated look in his eyes before everything went black. She whispered, almost choking on the words. Mark, he knew. He didn't want me to call the police. He said... Her voice broke. He said they'd only make things worse. Harris's expression darkened. He knelt closer, his tone low. Mrs. Parker, I need you to tell me everything. Because if Mark's involved, then this isn't just about a missing child. It's about a secret the government will do anything to bury. Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned the storm. He's her stepfather. He said his missions were classified, that I wouldn't understand. But he always avoided questions about that dog. Ranger. Why would he lie? Harris's jaw clenched. Because Ranger wasn't retired. He escaped. The word hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. Escaped. That meant he hadn't just wandered away, he'd been running. From what? From who? Harris leaned closer, his eyes drilling into hers. If Ranger found Lily, he won't leave her. That's what they were built to do. Protect, anticipate danger. But understand this, the people behind Sentinel. They'll come looking. And they won't care who they hurt. Her body trembled so violently, she thought her legs might give way. She sank into the chair, clutching the edge for support. Through the panic, through the storm of terror in her chest, one truth burned clear. Lily wasn't just lost. She was tangled in something far darker than Sarah had ever imagined. And Mark, her husband, wasn't who he claimed to be. The locket in her hand dug into her skin, a painful reminder of the child out there in the snow. She whispered through tears, her voice a vow. Then I'll find her before they do. I don't care what it takes. Harris nodded slowly, his jaw set. He glanced at the scattered files once more, his voice grim. Then we'd better start before it's too late. The forest swallowed them whole. Every step Lily took sank deep into the snow, her legs burning with exhaustion, her small body trembling under layers far too thin for a night like this. She gripped the ears of her stuffed rabbit with frozen fingers, her breaths ragged, her lips chapped and split from the cold. But she followed. She followed because the great dog before her Ranger moved with a certainty she couldn't ignore. The shadows seemed alive. The trees, heavy with snow, bent low as though eavesdropping on their struggle. The storm hissed through the branches, a constant chorus of whispers, warning her she didn't belong here. Yet every time fear threatened to paralyze her, Ranger glanced back. Those steady, amber eyes cut through the panic like a lantern in the dark. She was starting to believe in him. Starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. Ranger paused suddenly, his ears pricked, body tense. Lily nearly stumbled into him, catching herself just in time. Her heart thudded in her chest. What is it? She whispered, her voice trembling. The dog didn't answer, but his muscles rippled with readiness. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the icy air. A moment later, Lily heard it too. Footsteps. Not the cautious steps of wolves or the delicate padding of wildlife. These were heavier, measured, human. Her breath caught. She turned her head slowly toward the sound. Through the curtain of snow, faint beams of light flickered. Flashlights. Panic surged, hot and sharp, overriding the cold that had numbed her body. She crouched instinctively, clutching her rabbit tighter. Ranger moved closer, pressing his massive body against her, as if to shield her from sight. Voices floated through the storm, low, urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were searching, hunting. Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't know these men, but something in her gut twisted with dread. They weren't here to save her. They wanted her. Ranger nudged her gently, his muzzle pushing against her shoulder. She blinked, looking into his eyes, and once again felt that strange pulse of understanding. Stay quiet. Stay close. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. They moved again, Ranger leading each step, deliberate, silent. He guided her off the faint path and deeper into the underbrush, where the branches tangled low enough to hide them. Lily crouched low, copying him, as best as her small body could manage. Her little boots crunched faintly in the snow, and she winced at the sound, terrified it would give them away. Behind them, the voices grew clearer. Spread out. She can't have gotten far. Tracks lead this way. Keep your lights low. Her pulse thundered in her ears. They were so close. She could almost feel the sweep of their flashlights against her back. A branch cracked under her foot, loud in the silence. She froze. Ranger whipped his head back, his gaze burning into hers. He pressed his flank against her leg, firmly, steadying her shaking frame. She mouthed an apology, though no sound escaped her lips. The flashlights shifted suddenly, beams slicing through the snow in their direction. Lily's heart leapt into her throat. She ducked low, burying her face into Ranger's thick fur. He didn't move. Not an inch. He stayed perfectly still, his breathing deep and steady, a fortress against the terror closing in. The lights hovered, then slowly drifted away. One of the men cursed under his breath. Damn storm's covering the tracks. Spread wider. Their voices faded slightly, swallowed by the storm. Only when the dangers seemed to slip past did Ranger move again, his body unwinding from the tense coil of readiness. He nudged Lily gently once more, urging her to stand. She obeyed, though her legs shook so badly she thought they might give out beneath her. Her tears spilled freely now, hot against her frozen skin. She whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." He didn't respond, of course. But as he looked back at her, something in his gaze softened. She wasn't just a burden he was dragging through the snow. She was someone he had chosen to protect. For the first time since the accident, Lily felt the faintest flicker of hope. They pushed on. The forest grew denser, the snow deeper. The storm pressed down from above, but Ranger never faltered. He carved a path for her, his paws sure, even when the terrain grew treacherous. But the forest wasn't finished testing them. A sudden howl shattered the night. Lily froze mid-step, her head snapping toward the sound. It was long, mournful, echoing through the trees. Another answered. Then another. Her chest seized. Wolves. The sound surrounded them, bouncing off the trees until she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Her small body trembled violently. She clutched Ranger's fur without thinking, burying her face against him. No, no, no. Ranger's body stiffened. His ears stood tall, his eyes scanning the shadows with lethal precision. A growl built deep in his chest, low and steady. The first shape appeared slipping silently from the tree line, gray fur bristling under the snow. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Another followed. Then two more. Lily's breath came in quick, panicked gasps. She counted 4, maybe 5. They circled, forming a crescent around them. Ranger stepped forward, planting himself firmly between Lily and the predators. His growl deepened, resonating through the frozen air like a warning bell. The wolves paced, their eyes locked on him, their teeth glinting faintly in the low light. One barked sharply a challenge. Another crept closer, its paws silent on the snow. Lily whimpered, clutching her rabbit so tightly the seams strained. She whispered, her voice cracking, "Please, don't let them hurt me." Ranger's head turned just slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest heartbeat. And then that strange pulse again. Calm, steady, fierce. "I won't." The lead wolf lunged. Ranger met it midair, his teeth flashing a snarl tearing through the storm. They collided with a thud, snow exploding around them. The other wolves hesitated, startled by the sudden violence. Lily screamed, her small voice ripping through the night, but it was lost in the chaos. She fell backward, scrambling to her knees, watching in wide-eyed terror as Ranger fought with a ferocity she didn't think possible. The wolf snapped at his throat. But Ranger twisted his jaws, clamping down on its shoulder. The wolf yelped, thrashing snow spraying in frantic bursts. Another wolf darted in, snapping at Ranger's flank. He spun, teeth bared, forcing it back with a vicious snap that missed by inches. Lily's tiny hands shook so badly she could barely hold on to the rabbit. She whispered desperately, "Please, please, please." The circle tightened. 2 wolves flanked him now, one lunging, the other feinting, trying to draw his attention. Ranger stood his ground, his growl a constant rumble, his body a shield. One wolf lunged low, aiming for his legs. Ranger reared slightly, slamming his weight down his jaws, snapping so close to the wolf's throat that it yelped and darted back. Another howl pierced the storm farther away, distant. The pack paused, ears flicking toward the sound. Ranger seized the moment. He lunged forward, a snarl ripping from his chest, driving the wolves back. They faltered, uncertain now, their ears pinned, their tails flicking. Lily's breath caught her eyes wide. She could see it, the sheer determination burning in Ranger's stance. He wasn't giving them a choice. The wolves hesitated one moment too long. With a final bark, sharp and commanding, Ranger charged. The pack broke, scattering into the shadows, their howls fading as they retreated deeper into the forest. Silence fell again, broken only by the storm's endless howl. Ranger stood panting, his fur bristled, his chest heaving. Snow clung to his muzzle, streaked faintly with blood. Not as Lily realized with relief. Her tiny body trembled violently as she scrambled forward, throwing her arms around his neck. She buried her face into his fur, sobbing, "You saved me. You saved me." For a long moment he stood perfectly still, allowing her to cling to him. Then slowly he lowered his head, pressing it gently against her shoulder. The pulse came again, steady and sure. "You're safe, as long as I'm here." Lily's sobs softened into shaky breaths. Her fear hadn't vanished far from it, but in that moment, with Ranger's warmth pressed against her frozen body, she believed that he was more than just a dog. He was her protector, her friend. And as the storm raged on, she knew she couldn't let go. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and old grease, the kind of place where secrets clung to the faded wallpaper as stubbornly as the cigarette smoke that had stained it years ago. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, rattling the windows and burying the town of Aspen Ridge beneath drifts that would take days to clear. But Sarah Parker hardly noticed the cold anymore. She sat in a corner booth, hands wrapped tightly around a chipped mug she hadn't sipped from. Her knuckles were white, her mind a storm far louder than the one clawing at the walls. Across from her, a man in his late 60s studied her, with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that still carried the sharpness of a soldier, even after decades of carrying ghosts. He introduced himself simply as Colonel David Harlow. Sarah didn't want to believe what she was about to hear. She didn't want the possibility of truth. She wanted her daughter back whole, safe, alive. But the moment Harlow slid the manila envelope across the table toward her, the weight of the world shifted. Her trembling fingers reached for it, hesitated, then pulled it closer. "What is this?" "A record of something you were never supposed to know," Harlow said quietly, his voice a low rumble stripped of ceremony. "A project buried so deep the government pretends it never existed. We called it Sentinel." The word lingered in the air like the toll of a distant bell. Sarah's eyes narrowed, scanning the bold stamped letters across the first document she dared to slide out. The classified markings blurred with her quickened breaths. She forced herself to focus. "Sentinel." Harlow leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His weathered hands curled together, a habit of a man who'd held more weapons than cups of coffee. It began 15 years ago. The idea was to develop a new kind of protector. Not machines, not drones. Dogs. Her heart skipped. Dogs, specially bred, specially trained. Animals capable of sensing danger before it happened. Not just through instinct, but through engineered sensitivity. His voice faltered slightly, but he pressed on. They wanted guardians that could detect ambushes, explosives, even hostile intent seconds before the enemy made a move. Sarah's lips parted. "That's not possible." He gave a small, humorless chuckle. "That's what we thought too. But they made it possible, or close enough to try. Genetics, neural conditioning, the works. The program was ruthless, Sarah. Most of those dogs never made it past the first year." Her stomach twisted. The papers in her hands felt heavier, suffocating. She glanced down at one of the faded photographs, rows of German Shepherds, Malinois, even mixed breeds, lined up in a sterile facility. The notes beneath them were cold, clinical, reducing living, breathing creatures into data points. "And Ranger," she whispered. Harlow's gaze hardened. Ranger was one of them. In fact, he was the best we ever had. His ability to anticipate, it was unlike anything we'd seen. He saved lives in simulations no one else could pass. Then why? Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard. Why would you call him a failure? For the first time, Harlow looked away, his jaw tightening. Because he didn't obey. Because he chose who to protect. Sarah blinked, stunned. In the military, a weapon that doesn't follow orders is dangerous. They couldn't risk an asset that made its own decisions. They wanted control, and Ranger refused it. Her throat tightened as the pieces began to align in her mind. The way Lily had spoken about the dog she'd never met before, the strange bond she'd felt in her bones. The stories she herself had heard whispered when Mark had first taken that job up in the mountains, stories she'd brushed aside as nonsense. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Where is this going, Colonel? Harlow's eyes met hers again, sharp and unflinching. It's going to the truth you need to face, Mrs. Parker. Ranger didn't just wander into that forest tonight. He was meant to disappear years ago, put down with the others when the project collapsed. But he survived, and that makes him dangerous to the people who want Sentinel erased. Her pulse spiked. People like... She hesitated as though saying the name aloud would shatter the fragile line she was clinging to. Mark. Harlow didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Sarah's heart plummeted into her stomach. Memories flooded her. Mark's cold glances when Lily cried, the way he'd shut down every conversation about moving, about safety, about anything that mattered. The unexplained late-night calls, the long trips he refused to discuss. And tonight, the way he'd gripped the wheel too tightly before the crash, his knuckles white, his eyes wild. Her voice trembled. He knew. Harlow nodded grimly. More than knew. He was part of the cover-up. They couldn't risk the public finding out what Sentinel did, what it cost. So they buried it. And men like your husband made sure it stayed buried. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above them, but Sarah hardly heard. Her world tilted spinning under the weight of betrayal. My God. She whispered the words into her shaking hands. I'm sorry, Harlow said quietly. For the first time, there was something raw in his tone, regret heavy and unshakable. I should have come forward sooner. But the truth has a way of punishing those who speak it. You need to understand, Sarah, if your daughter is with Ranger, she's not just a lost child anymore. She's a threat to men who will do anything to silence what he represents. Her chest constricted, a sob clawing its way up. But beneath the grief and terror, something else ignited. Resolve. She lifted her head, her eyes burning with fresh fire. Then I have to find her. Before they do, Harlow studied her for a moment, then slid another file across the table. This one thinner, but no less damning. These are the coordinates of the old training grounds. If Ranger is leading her anywhere, it's there. That's where he remembers safety. Her fingers closed around the file like it was a lifeline. Harlow's voice lowered, each word heavy with warning. Be careful. If Mark is still alive, he won't let you walk away with her. Not with what she knows now. Not with Ranger still breathing. Sarah's breath hitched. The storm outside pounded harder against the glass, but her mind was already racing beyond the diner into the dark wilderness where her little girl walked with a dog. The government had branded a failure. She looked up at Harlow, her voice steadier than she expected. Then he'll have to go through me first. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm howled, the lights flickered, and somewhere far from that little booth in the corner of a forgotten diner, a 6-year-old girl trudged through the snow beside the only protector she had left in the world. And Sarah Parker knew one truth above all others. Nothing, no man, no lie, no shadow of the past would stop her from bringing Lily home. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every step. Snowflakes swirled violently through the night air, stinging Lily Parker's cheeks and soaking through the thin fabric of her jacket. She was shivering so hard, her teeth hurt her breath, coming in short, desperate bursts that clouded the air like ghosts. But Ranger kept moving, a shadow of strength against the merciless white. The dog's powerful frame carved a path through the drifts. His ears pricked, eyes scanning with an intensity that made Lily believe he knew exactly where they were going. Every so often he glanced back, his gaze locking with hers, as if to say, keep going. Trust me. Lily wanted to collapse, to cry, until the snow buried her where she stood. But every time her small boots faltered, Ranger slowed, nudged her gently with his muzzle, and pushed her forward. And so she did, because somehow in a world that had turned into a nightmare, this dog, this stranger, felt like the only thing keeping her alive. Minutes stretched into hours, though Lily had no way of knowing how much time had truly passed. The storm was getting worse. The trees moaned under the weight of the snow branches, snapping like distant gunfire. And then, through the veil of white, she saw it. A cabin. Its roof sagged beneath years of neglect, wood warped and darkened by countless winters. The windows were clouded, the porch nearly swallowed by drifts. But to Lily, it was a castle. Shelter, warmth, hope. Ranger barked once, sharp and commanding, then bounded ahead, paws kicking up snow in fierce rhythm. Lily's frozen legs carried her as fast as they could, her little heart pounding as the cabin loomed larger. When they reached the store, Ranger shoved his body against it. The wood groaned, then gave way, spilling a rush of cold, stale air into the night. Lily slipped inside, gasping as the wind slammed the door shut behind them. The interior smelled of rot and dust, but it was dry. The faint light of the storm seeped through cracks in the wood, casting eerie shadows across the single-room space. Broken furniture lay scattered, a wood stove sat cold in the corner, and a thin layer of snow drifted across the floor where the roof had given in. Lily hugged herself, trying to stop the shaking. Ranger circled the room, nose low, ears alert. And then he stopped, frozen, before a half-collapsed table against the far wall. He growled softly. Lily crept closer, heart thudding. She crouched down, brushing aside the snow. Something was hidden beneath a box, metal and rusted, its lid dented, but still locked. Her fingers were clumsy, stiff with cold, but desperation lent her strength. She pulled, scraped, tugged until the lid creaked open with a metallic groan. Inside, wrapped in a mildewed canvas bag, were papers. Her small hands trembled as she lifted them free, wiping away the moisture that clung stubbornly to the surface. The first page she unfolded was stamped with a word she couldn't read, but the bold letters felt important. Her eyes darted to a photograph tucked between the files, and the breath in her lungs froze. It was Ranger, younger, leaner, wearing a harness marked with a patch she didn't recognize. And beside him, men in dark uniforms, faces grim beneath the shadow of helmets. The photo was worn, edges curled, but there was no mistaking him. It was the same steady gaze, the same intensity. Tears pricked her eyes. You were with them?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ranger lowered his head, almost as if he understood, pressing his warm body against her side. For the first time that night, Lily felt more than just cold and fear. She felt connection, but the moment was short-lived. Outside, a crack echoed through the storm. Not a branch this time. Something heavier. A boot breaking through crusted snow. Then another, and another. Voices carried faintly through the wind, low, rough, urgent. Lily's eyes widened. She scrambled to gather the papers, stuffing them back into the box, but Ranger growled again, louder this time, his body rigid as he positioned himself between her and the door. The sound of men grew closer. Shadows danced against the cracks in the walls as flashlights cut through the storm. "Check the cabinet, man," barked his voice, muffled by the howl of wind. Panic surged through Lily. She clutched the photograph against her chest, her tiny hands shaking violently. Ranger's ears twitched, his muscles coiling like springs. Before she could move, the door rattled. "Kick it in." A crash split the silence as the door burst inward, sending snow swirling across the floor. Two men in heavy coats and masks stepped inside, rifles slung across their chests. Their eyes swept the room, landing on Lily crouched in the corner. There, one muttered. Ranger launched forward before they could move, a blur of fur and fury. He hit the first man hard, teeth snapping at the arm holding the weapon. The man shouted, stumbling back into the wall, struggling to break free as Ranger's growls filled the cabin. "Damn it, shoot the dog!" the second man roared. Lily screamed, throwing herself behind the overturned table. Her small fingers clutched the photograph tighter, tears blinding her vision. But the gun never fired, because outside another sound cut through the chaos, a sharp, commanding voice. "Drop it, now!" The intruders froze, glancing toward the doorway. Sarah Parker stood there, her breath fogging in the cold air, a pistol steady in her hands, despite the tremor running through her arms. Her eyes were wild, fierce, filled with a mother's fury. "Step away from her," she ordered, her voice breaking with both terror and resolve. For a moment, no one moved. The storm howled louder, rattling the cabin as if the world itself held its breath. Then Ranger growled again, snapping the man's weapon down and forcing him to the ground. The second intruder hesitated, his hand twitching near his rifle. Sarah's eyes locked on his. "Don't," she warned, her finger tightening against the trigger. "You so much as breathe wrong, and I swear you'll regret it." The man snarled, but slowly lifted his hands, the beam of his flashlight quivering against the walls. Sarah's heart raced as she stepped further into the room, her eyes darting between Lily and the chaos unfolding around her. Relief and terror collided so violently inside her chest, she could hardly breathe. "Mom." Lily's sob was raw, desperate. She stumbled from behind the table, clutching the photograph in her hand. Sarah's heart shattered. She wanted nothing more than to scoop her daughter into her arms to shield her from the nightmare closing in. But there wasn't time. Not yet. "Stay behind, Ranger," she ordered softly, her gaze flicking down to the dog, now standing guard between Lily and the men. The storm outside battered the cabin walls, furious and unrelenting. Snow seeped in through the cracks, as if the world itself wanted to erase the fragile moment of safety they'd found. Sarah forced herself to breathe, to stay steady. The men were stalling, waiting. For who? Her gut twisted with the answer she already knew, Mark. Her voice was steel when she spoke again. "Where is he?" Neither man answered. Sarah's jaw clenched. She took another step forward, the pistol unwavering. "Where is he?" Before either intruder could respond, a deafening crack thundered through the night, closer, this time sharper. And Sarah realized with horror it wasn't the storm. It was another gun. Outside, Mark was coming, and time was running out. The storm had grown merciless, slamming against the cabin walls with fists of ice and howls of wind that sounded almost human. Inside, Lily crouched in the shadows, clutching Ranger's thick fur with one hand and pressing the other tightly over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Her tiny chest rose and fell in frantic bursts, her heartbeat so loud she was certain the men outside could hear it through the wooden walls. Ranger was stone still beside her, his body a barrier of muscle and resolve. His ears flicked at every crunch of boots in the snow, every scrape of a branch in the storm. He did not tremble. He did not breathe louder than a whisper. He was waiting, watching, ready. Lily wanted to believe that meant they would be safe. But then she heard it, the heavy thud of boots on the porch, the low murmur of men's voices beneath the scream of the wind. "They're inside," a man hissed. The doorknob rattled once, then twice. Sarah's voice, sharp with defiance but shaking beneath the weight of fear, echoed through the small cabin. "You don't have to do this. Let us go and no one has to get hurt." A laugh, cruel and flat. "Lady, you don't get to make demands." Lily's heart dropped into her stomach. She dared a glance through the crack in the table where they hid. Sarah was standing near the center of the room, her pistol still raised, but trembling now under the barrel of a rifle pressed against her ribs. The intruders had her 3 men faces obscured by scarves and hoods, eyes glinting like cold steel. One of them twisted Sarah's arm, forcing her to drop the weapon. It clattered to the floor, useless. "Search the place," the tallest ordered. "The kid's here." Lily froze, breath locking in her throat. Ranger's low growl vibrated against her side, so soft it was nearly swallowed by the storm. Boots moved across the floorboards, heavy and deliberate. A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping dangerously close to the table. Dust motes danced in its path like betrayed secrets. Lily's fingers dug into Ranger's fur. "Please don't move. Please don't see us." Her body screamed to run, but her legs felt like stone. She knew if she bolted they would catch her before she reached the door. Ranger shifted just slightly, positioning himself between her and the gap where the light grazed. His body heat pressed against her, grounding her trembling frame. "Not here," one of the men muttered, frustration seeping into his tone. "They can't have gone far," another answered. "The storm would have killed them by now." Sarah's voice broke through again, raw with desperation. "She's just a child. Please don't hurt her. She has nothing to do with this." The man holding her chuckled low and bitter. "She has everything to do with this. You both do. You should have stayed quiet, Sarah. You never should have started digging." "I don't care what you're hiding," Sarah spat back. "I just want my daughter." Her defiance sparked something in Lily. The fear that had swallowed her whole began to flicker into something else, something sharper, something braver. She squeezed the photograph still tucked inside her pocket, the image of Ranger in his uniform pressed against her palm, like a promise. But then one of the men stopped. He turned, head tilting slightly, as if he had caught the faintest sound. His flashlight swung back toward the table. Ranger stiffened. The man took a step forward, another. Sarah saw it. Her eyes widened, darting to where Lily crouched unseen. "No!" she shouted suddenly, stepping forward with such force the man holding her had to yank her back. "Leave her out of this. She's not here." The man froze, suspicion flashing in his gaze. He glanced at Sarah, then back toward the table. Slowly, almost deliberately, he began to lower the beam closer. Ranger's growl deepened a dangerous rumble that vibrated in Lily's chest. The leader barked, "Check every corner. Now." The storm shrieked against the windows as the man crouched, flashlight in one hand, the other reaching for the edge of the table. Lily's world narrowed to the sound of her own pulse. She could see the man's glove just inches away. Could see the shadow of his face under the hood. Could hear the crunch of his boots shifting closer. And then Ranger moved. In a flash of muscle and fury, he lunged, teeth bared, slamming into the man before his hand could reach them. The flashlight skidded across the floor, its beam spinning wildly as the man crashed into a chair. Chaos exploded. "Get the dog!" one of them roared. Sarah screamed, struggling against the grip of the man holding her, her eyes wide with terror. "Lily, run!" she cried, her voice breaking through the madness. But Lily couldn't. Her legs refused. She was rooted, watching as Ranger fought with a savagery that both terrified and amazed her. He was outnumbered, claws scraping against the wood as the men swung boots and fists, trying to throw him off. And still he didn't let them near her. The leader raised his rifle, aiming at Ranger. Sarah gasped, thrashing wildly to knock it aside. But the man's strength overpowered her. "Don't," she begged. "Please don't shoot him," the leader sneered. "He's just a failed experiment. Nothing more." The words cut through Lily's fear like a knife. Experiment. The photograph in her pocket burned against her palm. She knew then Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And they wanted him gone. The rifle's barrel leveled on Ranger. The growls filled the cabin, deep and relentless. And then in the chaos, Lily made a decision. She shot out from behind the table, her small voice tearing through the storm and shouts like a thunderclap. "No. Leave him alone." The men jerked in surprise, the leader's aim faltering just enough. Ranger broke free, lunging at the gun, with all the strength left in him. The rifle clattered across the floor, skidding into the shadows. The leader swore furious as Ranger planted himself between Lily and the men, his teeth gleaming in the dim light, his body low and ready. Sarah cried out, tears streaking her face. "Lily, sweetheart, stay behind him. Don't move." The men regrouped quickly, their eyes dark with intent. "You think you can stop this, Sarah?" The leader sneered, his gaze cutting between mother, child, and dog. "You don't know what you're up against. This storm won't save you. Nothing will." The weight of his words filled the room, crushing, suffocating. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, tighter, as if the very walls knew the fragile line between life and death was about to snap. Sarah stood rigid, her chest heaving, her gaze burning. Lily clung to Ranger, her small fingers digging into his fur, her face pale but defiant. For one suspended moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the storm hammering the cabin, the growls vibrating through Ranger's chest, and the frantic heartbeat echoing in Lily's ears. They were surrounded, outnumbered. And one wrong move could shatter everything. Life thin as a thread was hanging in the balance. The room erupted into chaos, a storm within the storm. Ranger lunged, first his body a streak of muscle and fur teeth flashing white in the wavering beam of the fallen flashlight. He collided with the leader, driving him backward into the wooden wall with such force the man's breath left in a startled grunt. The rifle clattered away, useless now, in the shadows. "Get him off!" One of the others shouted, his voice cracking with both anger and fear. Ranger's jaws locked around the man's arm, the guttural growl ripping through the air. The leader howled, struggling, trying to shake free, but Ranger refused to release him. Blood smeared across his sleeve, dark against the pale glow of the flashlight. Lily's eyes widened, her small body frozen. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching the bundle of papers to her chest so tightly the edges bit into her skin. It was instinct, though she didn't understand why. Something deep inside told her these papers mattered, that they weren't just random pages, but something that could change everything. "Hold him down!" The second man barked, drawing a pistol from his belt. No, Sarah's voice ripped through the clamor. She moved in a blur, jerking her elbow hard into the ribs of the man restraining her. He cursed, grip faltering, and Sarah twisted, tearing herself free. She dove for the fallen pistol on the floor. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal just as the second man raised his weapon toward Ranger. Without thinking, Sarah aimed and fired. The gunshot cracked through the cabin, deafening against the storm outside. The bullet slammed into the wooden frame of the window just inches above the man's shoulder, showering him with splinters. "Drop it!" Sarah screamed, her chest heaving, her hands trembling, but steady enough to keep her aim locked. The man froze, eyes darting between her and Ranger, whose growl vibrated through the air like a living thunder. The leader, blood streaking his sleeve, hissed through clenched teeth. "You think you can stop this? You have no idea what you're up against." Sarah didn't flinch. "Try me." The tension in the room stretched tight and quivering. The storm outside pounded against the cabin, rattling the shutters, as if urging the moment toward an inevitable break. And then the third man, silent until now, stepped forward. His hood had fallen back in the scuffle, revealing eyes sharp with recognition. They locked on Lily, wide and terrified, clutching the bundle of papers against her chest. His lips curled into a chilling smile. "She knows." The words cut through the air like a blade. Sarah's gaze snapped to Lily, her heart slamming against her ribs. "No," she whispered, barely audible. The man nodded slowly, his voice low and deliberate. "The kid has it all. The files, the pictures. She's seen enough." Lily's fingers tightened on the papers, her small knuckles white. She wanted to deny it, to hide, but the truth was scrawled across her trembling face. The leader's expression hardened pain and fury, blending into something far worse than either alone. "Then she can't leave this cabin." Panic surged through Sarah like ice water. "Over my dead body." The second man shifted, eyes narrowing. "That can be arranged." Ranger barked a sound so sharp and feral it sliced through their words. His body bristled, positioning himself directly in front of Lily. His fur glistened with sweat and snowmelt, his eyes burning with a fire Sarah had never seen before. He knew, he understood. He was ready to die for the child behind him. Lily's throat burned with fear, but beneath it something stronger began to stir. Her world had always been small, fragile, dictated by the moods of a stepfather who never saw her as more than a burden. But in this moment, clutching the evidence and watching Ranger fight for her life, she realized she wasn't helpless. She mattered. She could choose. "Ranger," she whispered, voice trembling but clear. He flicked an ear back at her, never breaking his stare from the threat ahead. The leader, cradling his injured arm, sneered. "You think a dog and a scared little girl can stop us? We built him. We know his limits. He's nothing but a failed experiment." The word slammed into Lily like a physical blow. Her chest tightened, tears stinging her eyes. But she didn't loosen her grip on the papers. Sarah stepped forward, her gun unwavering. "He's not a failure. He's more human than any of you will ever be." The leader laughed, bitter and broken. "Human, he's a weapon, and like any weapon, he can be destroyed." At that, the second man lunged, trying to close the distance. Ranger was faster. He launched forward with a snarl, colliding with the man's chest, knocking him flat onto the floor. The pistol skidded across the boards. The man screamed, arms flailing as Ranger's teeth snapped dangerously close to his throat. The third man dove for Lily. No, Sarah shouted, firing again. The bullet struck the ground just in front of his boots. Splinters flying. He stumbled, cursing his hand, brushing the hem of Lily's coat before she scrambled backward, clutching the papers tighter. "Run, Lily." Sarah's voice cracked with urgency. But Lily didn't move. She couldn't leave Ranger. She couldn't leave her mother. The storm outside wailed, louder snow battering the windows, as if the world itself was warning them time is running out. The leader pressed his bloody hand against the wall. Forcing himself upright, his gaze locked on Lily like a predator that had already chosen its prey. If she gets out with those files, everything falls apart. His voice was low, deadly certain. "We end this now." Sarah stepped into his path, her gun aimed directly at his chest. "You'll have to go through me first." For the briefest moment, no one moved. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Ranger's growls reverberated low and menacing as the second man struggled beneath him, the third hovering uncertainly at the edge. And Lily pressed herself against the wall, the files warm against her skin, despite the freezing air. The leader's lips curled, his voice barely more than a whisper. "So be it." The forest was silent, except for the ragged sound of her breathing and the crunch of snow beneath her boots. Sarah's lungs burned with the cold, every inhale cutting deep like shards of glass. Branches bowed under the weight of the storm, releasing cascades of snow as the wind clawed through. She could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but her gut told her she wasn't alone. "Sarah." The voice came from the shadows, smooth and eerily calm, cutting through the shriek of the wind. Her heart stopped. She knew that voice. Mark stepped out from behind a cluster of pines. His coat dusted with snow, his expression unreadable in the pale light. The rifle slung over his shoulder glinted faintly. He looked like he'd been waiting. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, almost tenderly, as though they were meeting in the kitchen on a quiet morning instead of in a frozen forest littered with secrets. Sarah tightened her grip on the pistol in her hand, her pulse hammering. "Where is she?" Mark's lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Safe. For now." Her blood ran cold. "What did you do?" Mark tilted his head, taking a slow step closer, his boots sinking into the snow. "I did what I had to do." "You don't understand, Sarah. You never did." Behind her, Ranger's growl rumbled low, vibrating through the frozen ground. He planted himself between Sarah and the darkness beyond. Fur-bristling eyes locked on Mark. Mark glanced at the dog, his smirk hardening. Of course he's here. Always where he doesn't belong. Always trying to ruin everything. Sarah steadied her breathing, refusing to let her fear show. "Tell me where Lily is." Mark's eyes glinted with something dangerous. "She's fine. She has no idea what she's holding on to." "But you..." His tone sharpened. "You should have left well enough alone." Her voice cracked with fury. "You almost got her killed. You left her in that car. She's 6 years old, Mark." Something flickered in his expression. Shame, maybe, or regret, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He spread his hands, as though in surrender. "You think I wanted that? You think any of this was my choice? You don't know what's at stake here. I know enough." She took a step forward, gun raised. "I know you've been lying to me since the day we met. I know you've been hiding things about the project, about Ranger, about why you wanted us out here tonight." Her eyes burned. "And now I know you were willing to sacrifice Lily to keep your secrets." Mark's jaw clenched. "It's not like that." "Then tell me what it's like." She shouted the words tearing out of her throat. For a moment, the storm itself seemed to pause. Mark's gaze shifted, as though he was searching for a version of her that still trusted him. When he spoke, his voice was low, raw. The Project Sentinel was designed to prevent disasters before they happened. Dogs like him. They weren't just trained, Sarah. They were made. Built to sense danger, to anticipate threats. Ranger was the prototype. The only one who survived long enough to matter. Sarah's stomach turned. "So you knew." "I was there," Mark admitted. His face hardened, his breath fogging in the cold air. "And when it went wrong, when the others didn't make it, when the reports threatened to leak, I was the one who cleaned it up." "Do you understand what would happen if the truth got out? Entire careers destroyed. Billions of dollars lost. People imprisoned." Her voice dropped, trembling. "You mean you imprisoned? You mean your career destroyed?" Mark's eyes flashed. "I did it for us, for you, for Lily." Ranger barked sharply, the sound echoing through the trees, cutting through the lie. Sarah's hands shook, but she didn't lower the pistol. "Don't you dare use her name to justify what you've done." Mark's composure cracked just for a moment. His breath came faster, and his eyes darted to the bundle clutched under Sarah's coat. She has the files, doesn't she? Sarah's silence was answer enough. His expression shifted, darkening, the last trace of softness gone. She can't keep them. If those papers see the light of day, everything collapses. Everything I built, everything we built, gone. Sarah's throat tightened. You mean the lives you ruined? The animals you tortured? The little girl you were willing to leave in the snow? Mark's jaw flexed, his voice a whisper. You don't understand. Lily is the key. The words made her stomach drop. What do you mean? Mark's eyes locked onto hers, intense, unblinking. She saw it, Sarah. She saw the truth, even if she doesn't realize it yet. She's the one person who can expose everything, or protect it. If she stays quiet, if she forgets, no one will ever know. But if she talks... He let the sentence hang, the implication louder than any words. Sarah's breath caught her heart splintering under the weight of his confession. You're saying you'd silence her? Your own stepdaughter? Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was damning. Ranger snarled, stepping forward, every muscle-coiled teeth bared in a promise of violence. Mark's eyes flicked to the dog, his voice tightening. Call him off, Sarah. I don't want to hurt him. She steadied her aim, tears burning her vision. He's not the one you should be worried about. Mark took another step, his boots crunching in the snow. I don't want this to end badly. Give me the files, Sarah. We can walk away. Start over. Pretend none of this ever happened. Her laugh was hollow, bitter. Start over. After everything you've done. After you left my daughter to die in the cold. His jaw tightened, his voice rising with desperation. She's not even yours. The word struck like a gunshot. Sarah froze, the echo ringing louder than the storm, her chest-constricted breath catching in her throat. What did you just say? Mark's eyes darted as though he regretted letting it slip. But then he doubled down, his voice sharp-cutting. You heard me. You've been living a lie, Sarah. Lily's not your blood. You think you're her savior, her mother, but you're not. She's the reason everything fell apart. She's the reason I had to make the choices I did. The world tilted beneath her feet, the snow spinning, the storm roaring louder. Sarah's vision blurred with fury and disbelief. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You're lying. Mark's smile was cruel cold. Am I? Before Sarah could speak, Ranger lunged forward, his growl exploding into the air like thunder. He planted himself between Sarah and Mark, every inch of him radiating defiance. Mark steadied his stance, his hand twitching toward the weapon slung over his shoulder. Call him off, Sarah. This is your last chance. But Sarah's voice, though shaking, cut through the storm like a blade. No. This ends tonight. With the truth. With her safe. With you exposed. Mark's expression hardened into stone. The forest held its breath. Ranger crouched low, ready to spring the promise of violence, humming in the air. And then the world shattered as Mark roared and charged forward. The storm had teeth now. It wasn't just snow, it was a predator clawing at their faces, biting through their clothes, twisting the air into a frenzy that blurred the world into shades of white and shadow. The forest groaned under the weight of the blizzard, as if the trees themselves were watching, unwilling to intervene. Ranger stood taut and unyielding, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the man before him. Every bristle of his fur screamed of defiance. Mark's men fanned out their flashlights, cutting through the storm in broken shards of light beams, whipping back and forth like restless predators sniffing out prey. The crunch of boots on ice and the low hum of radios mingled with the howling wind. Sarah's pulse raced, pounding in her ears, drowning out the storm's roar. She stood with her back to Lily, pistol raised, her hands trembling, but steady enough to kill if she had to. Her eyes never left Mark, who now tightened his grip on the rifle slung across his chest. Mark's voice carried sharp and brittle against the wind. You don't want to do this, Sarah. Her answer was steady, though her throat felt raw. Neither do you. But we both know it's too late for anything else. Ranger's growl deepened a rumble in the snow-cloaked silence, the warning of a storm inside a storm. Then movement. A man lunged from Sarah's left, his flashlight beam blinding her. Ranger leapt with a snarl, a streak of muscle and fury. The impact knocked the man into the snow, his rifle flying from his hands as Ranger's teeth snapped inches from his throat. Get him off, the man screamed, thrashing wildly. Another figure surged forward, weapon raised. Sarah fired. The shot cracked like thunder, swallowed instantly by the storm. The bullet shattered the bark of a pine tree inches from the man's head. He faltered, ducking low, buying Ranger a heartbeat to clamp his jaws on the attacker's arm. Blood splattered on the snow, vivid against the blinding white. Ranger No, Lily's voice small but sharp, pierced the chaos. She crouched low in the snow, clutching the bundle of files against her chest, as if it were her heartbeat itself. Her wide eyes locked on the dog, willing him to survive, willing him to fight. Mark shouted, "Now take the girl." Two more men broke from the trees, their flashlights swinging like predators' eyes. One lunged toward Lily, his shadow blotting her out. Sarah's scream ripped from her chest. She spun, raising her pistol. But Lily moved first, her tiny hand trembling, but quick, grabbed a branch jutting from the snow. She swung with all the desperate force her 6-year-old body could summon. The branch cracked against the man's knee. He stumbled, cursing, collapsing to the ground. "Run, Lily," Sarah shouted. The child didn't hesitate. She scrambled to Ranger's side, eyes brimming with terrified determination. Her free hand clutched his fur, as though anchoring herself to the only thing in the storm that felt alive, real safe. Ranger's eyes flicked to her, then back to the men, reading her fear, her courage. His growl, deepened teeth bared in a savage arc of white. Mark's fury cut through the storm. "She's mine, Sarah. She's always been mine." Sarah raised the pistol again, her breath fogging in ragged bursts. "Not anymore." Mark's finger twitched on his rifle. The moment stretched, suspended on a knife's edge, every heartbeat louder than the wind. Then the forest exploded. Mark fired. Sarah dove sideways, the bullet tearing past her ears, searing the air. Ranger launched himself at one of the men lunging for Lily, his weight slamming into him with bone-jarring force. The man's scream was swallowed by the storm as Ranger's teeth tore into his jacket. "Hold him down!" Another man roared. Two more grabbed at Ranger, their gloved hands clawing at his fur. He bucked, twisted, snapping with a fury born from something deeper than instinct, something almost human. Lily, shaking, scrambled behind a fallen log, clutching the files to her chest. She could hear the men's grunts, Ranger's snarls, the crack of branches as bodies slammed against the frozen ground. She wanted to close her eyes, to disappear. But instead she peeked through a gap in the wood. She had to see. She had to help. Her eyes darted to the flashlight lying in the snow, its beam half buried, casting wild shadows on the trees. She crawled toward it, her little body shaking with the cold, with fear. With courage she didn't know she had. She grabbed it, turned it on Mark's face. The sudden glare blinded him for an instant. He cursed, throwing his arm up. It was all Ranger needed. He lunged again, teeth clamping down on the sleeve of Mark's coat, yanking with the force of desperation. Mark stumbled, his rifle tilting toward the sky. A shot cracked, echoing through the forest. "Sarah!" Lily cried. Sarah was already moving. She slammed into Mark from the side, the two of them crashing into the snow. His rifle slid across the ice, spinning out of reach. They grappled, his strength overpowering hers, his hands clawing for her wrists. "You'll ruin everything!" He spat, his face, twisted eyes burning. Her knee slammed upward, connecting with his stomach. He grunted, loosening his grip just enough. She snatched the pistol from the snow, pressing it to his chest. But before she could pull the trigger, one of his men tackled her, the gun flying from her hands. The air rushed from her lungs as she hit the ground, the weight of him crushing down. Sarah Lily's scream tore through the storm. Ranger, bloodied and panting, wrenched free from the two men holding him. He barreled into the attacker, pinning Sarah, teeth sinking deep. The man shrieked, rolling off his blood, staining the snow like spilled ink. Sarah gasped for breath, her chest burning, her body trembling with exhaustion and fury. She scrambled back to her feet, eyes locking on Lily, who was still clutching the flashlight and files. "Stay down, baby," Sarah cried. But Lily, her little face pale and determined, shook her head. She pointed the beam of the flashlight back at Mark, who was already rising snow, clinging to his coat, eyes blazing with rage. "You think you can protect her?" he roared, advancing, his breath steaming in the icy air. "You think you can keep the truth buried? You don't even know what she is." Sarah raised her fists, though her body ached. "She's my daughter. That's all that matters." Mark's snarl split the night. He lunged forward, and Ranger struck. He hit Mark with the full force of his body, teeth sinking into his arm. Mark screamed, the sound tearing through the storm, raw and furious. He swung wildly, trying to throw the dog off, but Ranger held fast, every muscle straining, eyes blazing with a savage promise. "You will not touch her." Snow sprayed as they crashed to the ground, rolling, thrashing, the rifle lying forgotten between them. Sarah staggered forward, her breath burning, her heart hammering. She reached for the weapon, her fingers brushing the cold metal. A hand clamped down on her wrist. Another man, face twisted with rage, pulled her back. She fought, twisting, kicking, but his grip was iron. "Mommy," Lily cried, voice breaking. In that moment, Lily's small frame moved. She leapt from behind the log, wielding the flashlight like a weapon. She slammed it into the man's face with all the force her little body could muster. The man howled, releasing Sarah as blood streamed from his nose. Sarah seized the rifle. Her hands shook as she aimed the storm screaming around her. Mark was still thrashing with Ranger, his face twisted in fury, snow-stained crimson beneath them. "Let him go," Sarah screamed. Mark froze his chest, heaving his arm locked in Ranger's jaws. He looked up at her, his expression a war between fury and pleading. "Sarah," his voice cracked, desperate now. "Don't. Think about Lily. Think about what she'll lose." Her eyes filled with tears. She's already lost enough. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The storm wailed louder, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The world had narrowed to a blizzard of chaos, a storm so fierce it blurred the line between earth and sky, between life and death. The snow fell heavier now, each flake stinging like shards of glass against their skin. The forest was a living, howling beast, and in the middle of its jaws lay the battered figures of Sarah, Lily, and Ranger. Ranger's body hit the ground with a sickening thud, a sharp yelp tearing from his throat. The sound carved through the night, shattering Lily's fragile bravery. She spun her little boots, slipping in the snow, her eyes going wide at the sight of him sprawled in the frost, his chest rising shallowly, his fur stained with crimson. "No!" The scream ripped from her throat, raw and broken. She stumbled forward, collapsing to her knees beside him. Her small hands trembled as they pressed against his side, trying desperately to hold him together, to keep the warmth from spilling into the cold. "Don't leave me, Ranger. Please, don't leave me." Mark's ragged breathing cut through the storm. He loomed a few feet away, his face pale with fury, his arm bloodied where Ranger's teeth had torn deep. Snowflakes clung to his lashes, to the blood on his cheek, turning him into something monstrous, half shadow, half man. He lifted the pistol he had wrestled free, his eyes burning. Sarah staggered forward, her lungs screaming for air, her rifle long gone. Every inch of her ached, but the sight of Lily, clinging to Ranger, tore through her exhaustion. She had no weapon now, no advantage, nothing but the pounding of her heart and the fire in her chest. "Mark," her voice rose above the storm. "Stop this before it's too late." He laughed bitterly, though his breath came in shuddering gasps. "Too late. It was too late the day you dragged me into your life. The day you kept her from me." His hand shook, but the pistol didn't waver. "She's mine, Sarah. You don't understand. She's the key. Without her, everything falls apart." Sarah's eyes flicked to Lily. The child was rocking Ranger gently, her tears streaking down her cheeks, whispering words Sarah couldn't hear, words that seemed to tether her to hope. Ranger's eyes fluttered, his breaths shallow, his body trembling with pain. "You'll kill her," Sarah whispered fiercely. "Whatever you think she is, she's a child. My child. And she will never be yours." Mark's snarl deepened. "You don't get it, do you? She's not just a child. She's the only loose thread. If she lives, they'll uncover everything. Do you think they'll stop with me? Do you think they won't come for you too?" Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Then let them come. But you're not touching her again." The world froze in that breath. The snow seemed to fall in silence for an instant, the storm pausing as though waiting to see which way fate would tilt. And then Mark raised the pistol toward Lily. "No." Sarah launched herself forward. Mark's finger tightened on the trigger. A sudden flash lit the night. A flare shot high above the tree line, blazing red through the storm. The crackle of fire in the sky burned like a desperate prayer. Sarah had yanked the emergency flare gun from her belt in those last frantic seconds, firing blindly into the night sky. The glow painted the forest in blood-red light, screaming for help into the void. Mark cursed, stumbling back momentarily blinded by the flare's searing brightness. Ranger, though broken and bleeding, surged with a final burst of strength. His body, driven by something beyond pain, beyond reason, lunged forward. His jaws clamped down on Mark's wrist, wrenching the pistol away. The shot went wild, echoing into the storm, harmless. Mark shrieked, striking Ranger with the butt of the pistol again and again. Each blow landed with sickening force. Blood stained the snow where Ranger fell back, his body curling protectively around Lily, even as his strength faded. Ranger Lily's scream split the storm. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face into his fur. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me. You promised." Her little voice cracked on the words, as if she could stitch his life together with them alone. Sarah scrambled across the snow, her hands reaching for Mark's weapon. He shoved her back, his fury wild now, his eyes glinting with desperation. "I'll finish this. No more delays." Sarah's voice was raw, fierce. She threw herself against him, clawing for the pistol. They crashed into the snow, their bodies a violent tangle, the storm swallowing their struggle. Lily, sobbing, pressed her forehead to Ranger's. "Please," she whispered. "Don't leave me in the dark. I need you." And something stirred. Ranger's eyes, heavy and fading, found hers. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The storm's howl dulled to a low hum. In her tear-streaked face, he found the only reason he needed. His breath shuddered out, slow but steady, and though his body trembled, his gaze locked with hers, fierce, unyielding. He wasn't done, not yet. A surge of strength rippled through him. With a guttural growl, Ranger forced himself upright, his body swaying, but his eyes burning. He stood between Lily and Mark once more, teeth bared despite the blood soaking his fur. Mark froze at the sight, disbelief flickering across his face. That dog should be dead. Sarah, breathless, her hands scraped and bleeding, used the moment to wrench the pistol free. She raised it, her arms steady now, her fury crystallized into resolve. "Step away, Mark," she commanded, her voice steel. For a flicker of a moment, the storm held them in suspension. Mark's heaving breaths, Sarah's trembling hands, Ranger's growl cutting through the blizzard, and Lily's soft sobs, her little arms wrapped around her protector. The sound came first, distant but growing. A whirring. Then a beam of light cut through the storm above. A helicopter. The flare had worked. Mark's eyes widened, panic breaking through his rage. No! No, not now. Searchlights sliced through the snow, sweeping across the trees. Voices crackled over radios. The pounding of boots against the snow approached. Mark made one last desperate lunge toward Lily. Ranger met him head-on. The impact was thunderous, man and beast, crashing into the snow, rolling in a blur of limbs and fury. Sarah raised the pistol, but the chaos was too close too fast. She couldn't risk hitting Ranger. Lily screamed, her little hands outstretched. Mark's fingers clamped around the dog's throat, pressing hard, his face twisted with venom. Ranger's body shook, the strength draining from him. His growl turned to a strangled whimper. Sarah's vision blurred with rage. She sprinted forward, slamming into Mark, driving him back. He hit the ground with a grunt, the pistol skittering into the snow. Ranger collapsed into Lily's arms, his breath shallow, his body limp. "No," Lily cried, her tears soaking into his fur. She cradled his head, rocking gently, her sobs breaking against the storm. "Don't leave me. Don't you dare leave me. You're my best friend. You're my hero. Please." Sarah knelt beside them, her own tears blinding her. She pressed her trembling hand against Ranger's chest. The beats were faint, fragile. "Hold on, boy," she whispered. "Just hold on a little longer." The helicopter descended, snow whipping into a frenzy. Voices shouted, boots thundered closer. Flashlights cut through the storm like salvation. Sarah grabbed the flare gun again, firing another shot into the sky, a second cry for help. The red light illuminated Lily's tear-streaked face, her arms wrapped tight around Ranger's broken body. Ranger's eyes fluttered. His gaze locked with Lily's one last time, soft, steady. His breath rattled, fading. And then, nothing. "No." Lily's scream tore the night apart. She buried her face into his fur, sobbing uncontrollably. "Don't go. Please don't go." The rescuers rushed in, Sarah screaming for help, her voice hoarse, broken. They pulled Mark away, shouting commands over the roar of the helicopter. But Lily couldn't hear them. All she could hear was the silence where Ranger's heartbeat should have been. She pressed her cheek against his fur, whispering through her tears. "You promised. You said you'd keep me safe. Please, Ranger. Please." And in that silence, in that storm, something stirred once more. A faint thump. Sarah froze. Her hand pressed to Ranger's chest. Another thump, weak, but there. And another. Her tears spilled anew, her voice breaking. "He's alive." Oh my God, he's alive. The rescuers swarmed in, one kneeling to lift Ranger gently, wrapping him in a thermal blanket. Lily clung to his paw until the last possible moment, her little voice whispering, "Don't leave me. Stay with me." Ranger's eyelids flickered, the faintest groan escaping his throat. The miracle had begun. The storm hadn't relented, but the sound of approaching voices and the thundering blades of the helicopter shattered the suffocating silence that had threatened to consume them all. Red light from the flare still glowed faintly against the swirling snow, casting everything in a surreal, blood-tinged haze. Lily clung to Ranger's paw, refusing to let go, as if her small touch could anchor him to this world. Sarah crouched beside her, her trembling fingers pressed against his chest, praying with every silent heartbeat that it wouldn't be his last. Then, through the chaos of the blizzard, beams of light cut across the trees. Men in heavy rescue gear appeared, their shouts breaking through the storm. "Over here," Sarah's voice was hoarse, cracking under the weight of desperation. She waved frantically, her arms slicing through the swirling white. Two rescuers sprinted forward, their snow boots crunching deep into the ice. One immediately knelt beside Ranger, pulling out medical equipment with practiced urgency. The other grabbed Sarah's arm, his voice firm but kind. "Ma'am, you're safe now. We've got you." Sarah shook her head violently, her hair whipping around her face. "Not me, him. Please, he's losing too much blood. You have to save him." Her voice broke raw and frantic. The medic pressed his gloved hands to Ranger's wounds, pulling gauze from his kit. "Stay with us, boy," he muttered under his breath, his tone betraying the fact that even he wasn't sure Ranger could make it. Lily's sobs rose louder, her little fingers gripping Ranger's fur like lifelines. "He can't go. He promised me. He promised." Another group of officers burst into the clearing. Their rifles raised flashlights, sweeping across the storm. They spotted Mark immediately. He was on his knees in the snow, his arms pinned behind his back by two officers. His face was twisted with fury, his eyes blazing like a cornered animal. "This isn't over," he bellowed, thrashing against the cuffs. His voice was hoarse, desperate. "You think you've won? You don't know what they'll do to you. You don't know." An officer shoved him forward, cutting off his words. "Save it for the judge." Sarah's eyes locked on him. For a fleeting moment, all the years of deception, all the pain, the manipulation, the fear, every wound he had carved into their lives, collided into one sharp, burning point in her chest. But then Lily's sobs pulled her back. She turned away from Mark. He was no longer the man who held her fate. He was just another prisoner now. "Mom," Lily's small voice trembled, breaking Sarah's heart. "He's not breathing right." Sarah leaned down, brushing the hair from Lily's damp forehead, her own tears sliding freely now. "They're helping him, baby. Ranger's strong. He's going to fight just like he always does." But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. Ranger's breaths were shallow, uneven, fading. The medics shouted toward the helicopter crew. "We need a stretcher now. He won't last in this cold." Within seconds, two rescuers arrived with a stretcher lined with thermal blankets. Gently, carefully, they lifted Ranger's limp body. Lily screamed in protest, clutching his paw, refusing to let go. "No, don't take him away from me." One of the rescuers crouched down to meet her tearful eyes, his voice soft but steady. "He's not leaving you, sweetheart. We're going to help him. But you need to let us carry him. Okay, he needs you to be brave now." Sarah wrapped her arms around Lily, gently prying her little fingers free. "We'll be right there with him," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "We won't let him be alone." As they placed Ranger on the stretcher, Sarah's eyes caught a glimpse of the folder still clutched against Lily's chest. The edges were wet from melted snow, but the words stamped across the front were still clear. Project Sentinel. Classified. Her blood ran cold. "Sarah!" A voice cut through the chaos. She turned to see a man approaching, his weathered face shadowed by the hood of his coat. Recognition hit her like a punch. Colonel James Whitaker, a name she hadn't heard in nearly a decade. He pulled down his hood, his stern gaze softening as it met hers. "I heard the flare. I knew it had to be you." "Colonel," her voice faltered. "What the hell is going on? What is this?" She gestured toward the file Lily held, her body shaking with rage and confusion. Whitaker's jaw tightened. His eyes shifted toward the stretcher where Ranger lay pale and motionless, then back to Sarah. "It's the truth. The truth we were ordered to bury." Sarah's breath caught. "Sentinel. It's real." He nodded gravely. They wanted to create the perfect line of protectors. Dogs who could sense danger before it happened. Most didn't survive the training. Ranger, he was the only one who did. But when they realized he wasn't controllable, when they realized he wouldn't follow orders to harm innocent people, they labeled him a failure. Lily's tear-streaked face tilted upward. "He's not a failure," she whispered fiercely. Her voice carried a surprising strength, a child's defiance forged in love. "He saved me." Whitaker crouched down, his stern expression softening as he looked into her eyes. "You're right, sweetheart. He's the bravest one of us all." Sarah swallowed hard, the pieces clicking together like jagged shards of glass. "Mark, he knew." Her voice broke with the weight of the truth. He knew, and he still. Whitaker's eyes hardened. He was helping them keep it quiet. "That file, it's the evidence. Enough to bring the whole operation crashing down." Sarah's gaze fell on Lily, still clutching the folder to her chest. She knelt beside her, brushing the child's frozen cheeks. "You did so good, baby. You kept it safe." Lily sniffled her eyes, darting to Ranger. "But it doesn't matter if Ranger doesn't wake up. Sarah's throat tightened, her arms wrapping around her daughter. "He's going to wake up." "He has to." The helicopter crew called out, motioning for them to board. The stretcher was lifted carefully, Ranger's limp body swaddled in blankets. Sarah scooped Lily into her arms and followed, her heart hammering with every step. Inside the helicopter, the roar of the blades drowned everything else. But Sarah couldn't hear it over the sound of Lily's quiet sobs. The medic worked frantically, checking Ranger's vitals, injecting fluids, wrapping tighter bandages. "He's critical," he shouted over the noise. "But if we get him to the hospital fast enough, there's a chance." Sarah squeezed Lily's hand, her other hand resting on Ranger's paw. "Did you hear that, sweetheart? There's a chance." Lily leaned down, her lips brushing Ranger's ear. "Please hold on, Ranger. We're not done yet." The helicopter lifted off, leaving the storm behind. Hours later, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the soft crackle of a hospital fireplace filled the room. Sarah sat in a chair beside the bed, her daughter curled in her lap, her small head resting against her chest. Ranger lay on the bed beside them, tubes and monitors connected to his body, his breaths shallow but steady. The warmth from the fireplace painted the room in soft gold, but Sarah's heart was still locked in ice. She watched the rise and fall of Ranger's chest with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Every beep of the monitor was a lifeline, every pause a threat. Lily stirred slightly, opening her eyes. "Is he going to be okay?" she whispered. Sarah pressed a kiss to her hair, her tears glistening. "He's fighting, baby. And he's not alone." The door creaked open. Colonel Whitaker stepped inside, his expression somber. He held the now dry file under his arm. "It's already started," he said quietly. "The moment this file is in the right hands, Sentinel will be exposed. They won't be able to hide it anymore." Sarah glanced at Ranger, then back at Whitaker. "I don't care what happens to them. All I care about is him." Whitaker's gaze softened. Maybe that's exactly why he fought so hard. Because for the first time, someone cared more about him than what he was made for. Lily slid off her mother's lap, padding barefoot to Ranger's side. She climbed carefully onto the bed, curling up beside him, her little hand slipping into his paw. Her eyes fluttered shut, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll wait as long as it takes." The fire crackled softly. The storm outside had calmed, but in the small room, the true battle continued. Ranger's chest rose and fell, faint but steady, as if even in his dreams, he was still keeping his promise. And Sarah, watching her daughter's small hand tangled with Ranger's paw, finally let a fragile spark of hope bloom in the darkness. The sterile rhythm of the heart monitor ticked away the longest night of Sarah Parker's life. The fire in the hospital hearth had burned low, its embers casting faint golden hues across the quiet recovery room. Snow no longer battered the windows. The world outside had surrendered to an eerie stillness. But inside, Sarah's chest ached with the raw weight of waiting. She sat close to the bed, her hand wrapped around Ranger's paw, as if sheer will could tether him to the earth. Lily had fallen asleep beside him hours ago. Her tiny body curled against Ranger's flank, her breath soft and steady. She hadn't let go since the moment they'd carried him into the room, as if her fragile touch was the bridge holding him in this world. Sarah's eyes lingered on her daughter's face, innocent, yet scarred by what no child should ever endure. The monitor beeped steadily, but the dog's stillness was suffocating. Sarah leaned closer, whispering into the silence. "You can't leave us now, Ranger. You've carried her through hell. You've carried me too, even if you don't know it. Please, come back." For a long moment, nothing. The hush of the room pressed down on her, the shadows of doubt gnawing at her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying harder than she ever had in her life. Then it happened, a twitch, barely there. Ranger's paw shifted under her hand. Sarah's eyes flew open, her breath caught. She leaned closer, hardly daring to believe. His ear flicked, then his chest rose a fraction deeper. The monitor's rhythm quickened, and a faint, raspy breath escaped him. Ranger Sarah's voice cracked. Lily stirred, blinking sleepily, as if sensing the change. Her eyes widened instantly, her little hands flying to his muzzle. "Mom," he moved. Her voice was shrill with hope, cutting through the heaviness like sunlight through clouds. Ranger's eyelids fluttered open. His gaze was weak but clear, and in that moment the dull hospital lights seemed to vanish, replaced by the glow in Lily's face as her smile burst through tears. "You came back," she whispered, her forehead pressing gently to his. "I knew you wouldn't leave me." Ranger's tail gave the faintest thump against the sheets, a sound so small, yet so monumental it drew a sob from Sarah's throat. The door opened quietly, and Colonel Whitaker stepped inside, his usual sternness softened by the sight before him. He paused, letting the moment breathe, then offered a quiet nod. "He's a fighter. I knew he wouldn't give up." Sarah looked up, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "He shouldn't even be alive. Not after everything." Whitaker's gaze fell on Ranger, then Lily. "Maybe he's alive because he finally had a reason to be." Sarah's heart clenched. She brushed a hand through Lily's hair, watching as her daughter whispered softly to the dog, her words more like prayers. Ranger's eyes followed every sound, tired but unwavering. Hours later, as the sun broke through the clouds outside the once gray sky, painted the world in hues of rose and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so pure it felt almost sacred. Nurses entered, checking Ranger's vitals, murmuring in amazement at his progress. One leaned toward Sarah, smiling gently. "He's going to make it." Sarah closed her eyes, a sob of relief escaping her lips. She pressed a kiss to Lily's head, the weight on her chest finally lifting. Lily's face lit up with a radiance Sarah had thought she'd lost forever. "I told you," she said proudly. "He promised me." By midday, the snow outside glistened under a pale sun. The world seemed reborn, as if the storm had been nothing more than a trial they had endured together. Sarah helped Lily into her warm coat, then carefully clipped Ranger's leash onto his collar. Though still weak, he rose slowly, determined, leaning slightly into Sarah's hand for balance. As they stepped into the hallway, the buzz of reporters outside was already swelling rumors of a military project exposed of a dog who wasn't supposed to survive. Whitaker walked beside them, the classified file clutched firmly under his arm. "Once this is in the right hands, no one will ever be able to use a project like Sentinel again." He made sure of that. Sarah glanced at Ranger, her voice steady now. "Then he didn't just save Lily. He saved countless others." Whitaker gave a faint smile. "He was meant to be a weapon. Instead, he became a guardian. That's what they'll remember." At the hospital's front doors, Sarah paused. Through the glass, the world shone bright and unbroken. The snow had stilled sparkling under the sunlight, as though every crystal reflected a fragment of their survival. She looked down at Lily, who held Ranger's leash proudly, her eyes shining with the boundless innocence of a child who had stared into darkness and still found light. "Ready?" Sarah asked softly. Lily nodded, her smile radiant. "Ready." Together they stepped into the sun. Ranger's ears perked at the warmth on his face, his tail wagging weakly, but full of promise. The cold sting of the storm had been replaced by the gentle kiss of sunlight, a sign of everything they had endured and everything still ahead. As the doors closed behind them, Sarah felt a truth settle deep in her chest. Ranger hadn't just saved Lily from the storm or from Mark's cruelty. He had saved Sarah from her own despair, from the hopelessness that had wrapped itself around her life for far too long. For the first time in years, Sarah felt whole. Not because the battle was over, there would be trials ahead, wounds to heal, truths to face, but because they were no longer facing them alone. The three of them, mother, daughter, and the dog who had defied everything, walked out into the brightness of a new day, the warmth of the sun breaking across their faces. And though the shadows of Sentinel would linger in whispered rumors and government files, Sarah knew the truth. Love, loyalty, and courage had shattered the darkness. Lily squeezed Ranger's leash, tilting her head up toward the sky. "See, Mom?" The snow stopped crying. Sarah smiled through her tears, her arm wrapping around her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart. It's finally over." The final image lingered as they walked together into the sunlight. A small girl with a brave smile, a mother whose strength had been reborn, and a dog once cast aside, now the heart of a new family. Because sometimes love isn't just about survival. It's about resurrection. And in that moment, under the golden sun and the endless stretch of sky, Sarah knew love had won.